In a world of simplicity, a single decision can change everything. When Samuel Bridger set out to build a cabin in the wilderness, he was mocked for his meticulous methods. But what seemed like wasteful caution would prove to be the difference between life and death. This is the story of how one man's obsession with survival led to a design that would change frontier construction forever. Before we begin, share where you're watching from. If stories of innovation and survival touch your heart, join us for tomorrow's tale. Samuel Bridger sat quietly on the rock ledge, looking out over the Montana wilderness. The wind howled around him, but the trees remained still, their branches gently swaying against the cold. Winter was coming, and with it, the quiet whispers of danger, the kind that would tear through the weak and leave only the strong behind. In his mind, the design of his cabin formed like a distant dream, a vision born from a tragic encounter that had left a friend's body cold in the dirt. A grizzly bear had taken John Hoffman in a way that would haunt Samuel for years. He had seen death up close in the wild, but this was different. This was a realization that their way of living, their houses, and their tools were simply not enough to fight the wilderness. The cabin they had built together, a typical mountain structure, was no different from others. Logs notched at the corners, moss and mud wedged into the gaps, a door that barely held against the wind. A grizzly had torn through these defenses as easily as a child rips through paper. And yet, Samuel had noticed something else in that moment of horror. The flaw wasn't the strength of the animal, it was the weakness in their shelter. The very thing that was supposed to protect them had instead left them exposed. It wasn't enough. When he left the mountains in the spring, Samuel wasn't thinking of the bear or his grief. Instead, his mind raced with ideas on how to build something better, something that could withstand the fiercest attack and survive the harshest winters. What he needed was a stronghold, a fortress. He wasn't sure how, but he knew one thing for sure. The way they had built houses before would never be enough again. The journey to St. Louis took weeks, each day filled with the thoughts of construction. He spent his nights in small towns, watching the buildings around him, studying the ways bricks interlocked, and how iron brackets held stone structures together. The mountain men of the past had built with what they knew: wood and stone, raw materials from the earth. But Samuel wasn't interested in doing what everyone else had done. He was interested in something different, something better. By the time he reached the city, he had already formulated a plan, a design that would change everything. Samuel wasn't just going to build a cabin, he was going to create a structure that could stand against anything the wilderness could throw at it. By late summer, Samuel had returned to Montana, but this time his pack was heavier. He didn't carry the usual supplies of salt, powder, and pelts. He carried iron, nails, and tools he had never before thought necessary. His mind was sharp, focused on the task ahead, and his hands were ready to bring his vision to life. The first step was the foundation, a shallow trench dug around the perimeter of his new cabin site. It was a small detail, but one that would provide stability when the snows came. Most mountain men never considered a foundation. Their cabins stood on the earth, vulnerable to shifting, settling, and flooding. But Samuel wasn't just building a cabin, he was building a lasting structure. The foundation was only the beginning. Samuel carefully chose his logs, rejecting any with significant taper or irregularities. Each log had to be uniform in size, something he hadn't seen in any of the frontier cabins. The logs were stripped of their bark and shaped with a draw knife to ensure a tight fit. The corners were where most cabins failed, Samuel knew. Notched logs created weak points, places where the structure would inevitably give way under stress. So, he devised a new method. He extended the logs beyond the corners by 2 feet, creating a unique overlap. This wasn't just for aesthetics, it was to eliminate the leverage points where bears could pry the structure apart. Once the logs were in place, he drilled through the overlapping sections, driving iron pins to secure the structure. The connection was now as strong as any stone foundation. Each log interlocked like a puzzle, and the iron pins ensured that no log could shift or move under pressure. This method was revolutionary. It required patience, but Samuel was patient. He had learned that in the mountains, rushing only led to failure. The chinking between the logs wasn't made from the usual moss and mud. Samuel created a mixture of clay, horsehair, and pine resin, something more durable, something that would hold against the wind, the rain, and the snow. As he packed the warm mixture into the gaps between the logs, he could feel the weight of the wilderness lifting. For the first time, he felt confident in his shelter. It took weeks to finish, far longer than the typical cabin, but Samuel wasn't interested in cutting corners. When the walls stood tall, he turned his attention to the roof. He constructed it with multiple layers, split planks, birch bark, and sod, each layer providing insulation, protection, and waterproofing. His roof was designed to withstand even the heaviest snowdrifts, and unlike most mountain roofs, it would never collapse under the weight of the winter storms. Samuel didn't just build for the present, he built for the worst. And when that worst came, he knew he would be ready. As the summer days began to fade and the chill of fall crept in, Samuel's cabin, now fully constructed, stood as a silent testament to his labor and vision. The strong walls, the iron-pinned corners, and the thick roof were complete. Yet, Samuel couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the real test was yet to come. His cabin, unlike anything the mountain men had built before, would be put to its true test when the first snow fell, when the winds began to howl and the ground hardened under the weight of winter. For now, the stillness of the wilderness surrounded him. The occasional rustle of wind through the trees and the distant cry of a hawk were the only sounds that disturbed the quiet. He knew that in the coming months, the world would change. The snow would come, and with it, the dangerous isolation of the frontier winter. The first test came earlier than expected. A cold front swept in one evening, and by morning, snow blanketed the ground. Samuel, who had grown accustomed to the unpredictability of the seasons, wasted no time. He had already prepared his firewood and stocked up on supplies, but it wasn't the supplies that worried him, it was the strength of the shelter he had built. Would it hold against the onslaught of winter? Samuel stepped outside to inspect the cabin. The walls stood firm, unyielding to the gusts of wind that slammed into the structure. He could feel the cold, but it didn't seep inside. The chinking between the logs had held strong, the clay and horsehair creating a flexible, airtight seal. Samuel felt a surge of pride. The elements outside were harsh, but inside, it was quiet and warm. This was exactly what he had set out to create, a fortress against nature's fury. As the days grew shorter and the snow piled higher, the winds grew stronger. Samuel's cabin endured, its thick walls and layered roof shrugging off the worst of the storm. He had built it for this. It wasn't just a home, it was a shield. And in that moment, he knew that the other trappers who had mocked him would soon feel the truth of his labor. They had built quickly, with haste and minimal concern for the Dan-Black ascension for the waste future, but he had built slowly, carefully, with every aspect designed to withstand the worst nature could throw at it. Word of his cabin began to spread through the wilderness. Trappers who had heard about the fortress stopped by to see it for themselves. Samuel wasn't trying to prove a point or boast. He was simply surviving, but as the snow piled up outside, the survivors, those who would make it through the season, were increasingly turning to him for advice. One night, a man named William Marshall, who lived several miles from Samuel, came to visit. Marshall's cabin, like most others, was typical one that had been built with haste and minimal care. As he approached Samuel's cabin, he saw the smoke curling from the chimney and the solid structure standing tall against the bitter wind. He knocked at the door, and Samuel let him in, offering warmth and food. Marshall was cold, both from the winter's grip and from a deep, unspoken concern. "The storm's come," early, Marshall said, rubbing his hands together. "I don't know how long my cabin can hold up. I've heard what you've done here. I might need your help, Samuel. I might need to rebuild." Samuel said nothing at first. He simply gestured to the fire, knowing that the truth would be felt in time. The winter would sort the strong from the weak, the prepared from the unprepared. The first blizzard of the season had passed, but the threat of winter wasn't over. Samuel spent the next few weeks checking his traps and fortifying his cabin against the coming months. It was during this time that the reality of his situation began to shift. The trappers who had once mocked his slow pace of construction were now seeking him out for advice. They had underestimated the harshness of the winter, and many were finding that their cabins, built with haste and minimal care, were no match for the relentless cold and snow. One by one, trappers began to arrive at Samuel's cabin, seeking shelter or guidance. Each man had a story of trouble, ripped roofs, cracked walls, and fires that couldn't keep the cold out. Samuel welcomed them in, never bragging about his own cabin, but always offering what advice he could. His cabin, unlike theirs, was holding strong. It stood as an island of warmth amidst the harsh wilderness, its double-thick walls and carefully designed structure providing shelter not only for Samuel but for others in need. As the days grew shorter and the cold became more biting, the cabins of Samuel's visitors began to falter. Some had notched corners that had begun to shift, allowing cold air to creep inside. Others had chinking that cracked and shrank, leaving gaps where the wind howled through. And worse, the roofs of some began to sag under the weight of snow, threatening to collapse altogether. Marshall, the man who had come to Samuel for help, was one of the first to return. He arrived in late January, looking gaunt and weary. His cabin had held through the first few storms, but the continuous battering of snow and wind had finally broken it. "I'm done, Samuel," he said, his voice hoarse. "My cabin, it's gone. I can't stay in it another night. It's freezing inside." Samuel nodded, not out of pity but understanding. He had known the moment would come. The storm was far from over, and Marshall's experience was the reality many others would face. "Come in," Samuel said. "There's room by the fire. We'll figure it out in the morning." That night, Marshall stayed in Samuel's cabin, surrounded by warmth and comfort. He marveled at the resilience of the structure. Samuel didn't boast or claim victory. He simply shared his shelter. As the days passed, more trappers arrived, each one seeking refuge, each one learning that the fortress Samuel had built was more than just a house, it was a lifeline. By February, with the snow still falling relentlessly outside, Samuel's cabin had become a gathering place. It was a beacon of survival, a symbol of what could be accomplished with time, effort, and a deep understanding of the wilderness. It wasn't just about the construction, it was about foresight. Samuel had built for the worst, and while many of his neighbors were now learning the hard way, Samuel's foresight had kept him and those who sought shelter with him safe from the worst that winter could offer. Samuel had seen the mountain's fury before, and this time his shelter stood strong. He wasn't just surviving. He was proving that patience, care, and preparation were the keys to surviving in the frontier. By the time the spring thaw finally began to creep in, the wilderness had been transformed. The bitter cold that had once gripped the land began to retreat, and the sun broke through the heavy cloud cover to reveal a world blanketed in white. Samuel stood outside his cabin, the wind now gentle and warm, watching the snow melt slowly away from the trees. The winter had been long and brutal, but they had survived it. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, its warmth now a faint memory in the walls. The cracks and the chinking had settled, but the cabin's strength remained as solid as the day it had been built. Samuel's thoughts drifted over the past few months, the visitors who had come, each with their own story of struggle and survival. Some had stayed only for a night, others for weeks. But all had left with more than just the warmth of the fire. They left with a lesson learned in patience, preparation, and foresight. Samuel wasn't a man who sought accolades, but he knew that something had changed during this winter. His cabin, once considered a strange and unnecessary expense, had become a symbol of survival. The other mountain men had learned from him, not just about the construction of a building, but about the necessity of thinking beyond the immediate, beyond the comfortable. They had learned that true survival wasn't about being tough or fast. It was about being wise and deliberate. One morning, as the first signs of spring showed in the distant hills, Samuel received a visitor he hadn't expected, William Marshall. The man who had once questioned his methods now stood at his door, hat in hand. His face was drawn, but there was a different light in his eyes, one that had not been there before. "I built the cabin you would have built," Marshall said quietly, his voice low with sincerity. "I should have listened to you from the start." Samuel nodded, acknowledging the change. "It's never too late to build it right." Marshall stood there for a moment, as though trying to find the right words. "You were right. When the blizzards came, I thought I was ready, but I wasn't. I barely made it through, and when I saw how your cabin withstood it all, I knew I had to rebuild." He paused, then added, "I came to thank you for showing me how to build better." Samuel didn't respond immediately. He had heard the words, but it was the quiet realization in Marshall's eyes that spoke louder. In the end, Samuel hadn't needed to be right, nor had he needed to be the one to teach. His actions, the structure he had built, had done that for him. His patience had saved lives, had given others the chance to survive. Marshall's visit was not the last. As word spread of the lessons learned during that harsh winter, more trappers and settlers came seeking advice. They had seen the truth in Samuel's cabin. They had felt the difference between building for necessity and building for survival. Samuel's cabin had outlasted every other structure in the area, its walls still standing as a testament to foresight. Years passed, and Samuel grew older, but the lessons he had taught, both through his cabin and his actions, continued to echo across the land. The building techniques he had used became standard in frontier construction. His meticulous design of the doors, the iron-reinforced corners, and the layered roof all became the foundation of safer, more durable homes across the Rocky Mountains. When Samuel passed away quietly in 1871, his legacy was not written in books or carved in stone. It was embedded in the logs of the cabins that stood strong against the wilderness. In every cabin that survived a winter storm, in every structure that withstood a grizzly's attack, Samuel's wisdom lived on. His story became a legend, told by settlers and trappers to those who would listen. The tale of the man who built a cabin not just for himself, but for anyone who needed shelter, would continue for generations. And in the heart of the Rockies, in the silence of the mountains, the legacy of Samuel Bridger, his patience, his foresight, and his understanding of the land endured. In the end, his cabin had not only withstood the elements, it had taught a community to survive, to build, and to think beyond the immediate. Samuel had built not just a structure, but a foundation of wisdom that would last far longer than the harshest winter.